One. Welcome everybody to episode, it doesn't even matter anymore, the next episode of Manbuns and Jesus. I'm Josh. I'm Pastor Josh Laborious. I'm the pastor of Edgewater Lutheran Church in Eastvale, California, in Southern California. And that over there, or if you're listening, the other voice on the podcast is going to be Ben Olschlager, who got a new mic this week. So everybody, congrats to Ben for upgrading his audio quality a little bit. He is the pastor of Good Shepherd in Michigan, near Detroit.
Close enough. Lake Orion, Michigan.
Yeah, that one.
Spelled like Orion, but it's Orion because I don't know. Midwesterners love to butcher names, I think. Anyway, Josh and I are taking this one off the rails a little bit this week. We got on the call. We got on the call this week and decided that we wanted to talk about something "quote unquote" fun. And when I say
us,
fun,
not for everybody. Let's be
yes,
clear.
I mean fun for us, not for everyone else. So we're going to talk about critical theory because this is something that we enjoy kind of diving into and looking at from a theological, sometimes academic, sometimes pastoral perspective. And really kind of wade into what is this actually, because it's become such a like boogeyman for so many people, both within the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, our home denomination, and especially
and just
in
everywhere. This is a big thing for a lot of people.
Yeah, but in conservative denominations, it's become a huge boogeyman, and it's become a weapon on the more liberal side of churches and politics. And so we're going to take a look at what it actually is. Should we be afraid of it? And are the responses that we see in culture to it healthy? That's a lot to accomplish in one podcast.
And break.
So we'll see what we actually get done today, but we'd like to do that over the course of one or two podcasts, and we'll see what we get done today in the time that we have. So Josh, you mentioned in our quote unquote planning for today's episode that you've done some digging into to especially critical race theory. So let's start there. What is your understanding of critical race theory, and do you know much about the scope of critical theory in general, above and beyond just critical race theory?
Okay.
And maybe I can respond from there.
So I'm going to be real upfront. And I guess I got to be careful when I say this. I am much more familiar than the average LCMS pastor on the workings of critical race theory. And I can extrapolate and assume how that would apply to general critical theory. But I'm not super familiar with critical theory in general. So to kind of explain my background, my understanding of critical race theory, I took I think it was my sophomore year at Vanderbilt. One of my majors was education, and one of the classes for education is a class called the Social and Philosophical Aspects of Education, or Foundations of like something like that. And we get there day one, and the teacher says,
academic sounding.
Yeah. And the teacher says very upfront, she's like, this is going to be a social justice class. Which wasn't, if you're familiar with Vanderbilt, it's a very, in a lot of ways, it's a very typical liberal arts university. You have a lot of people there that are too smart for their own good and trying to self-justify how much they get paid, frankly. And they just unveiled a new logo, which is stupid. It's not a good looking logo. They're like, we're rebranding, and I was like, your brand was actually really nice, and now they picked a bad font.
It's just a V.
It used to be like a classy V and a star, or a V with like an oak leaf in it, and now it's just a really dumb V. That's not even proportioned well. Anyway, so I'm taking this class in part. So this professor's dissertation was on critical race theory as it applies to education. I believe I have I didn't look at what her dissertation was. I didn't care. I still frankly don't care. I don't even remember her name. But one of the papers we read in the class was like the foundational work for critical race theory. So the core of what I understand critical race theory to be is it looks at larger systems and statistics and trends that they see in larger systems and equates that causally to systematic racial inequality. So what I would assume more generalized critical theory is you're looking at systems for systematic inequalities and systematic problems. Now I like full disclosure, like I'm just going to be really upfront with kind of where I stand on a lot of this stuff, because first of all, for you listening, then you can stop guessing where I'm at. And we can talk and kind of where I'm coming from. And I'm like, newsflash, none of you are going to be fully happy with me. So on the one hand, like I said, I've read the foundational paper for critical race theory. And my second major in undergrad was mathematics. The statistics they use in that paper, it was not a well-conducted use of statistics. They very early in the paper, they kind of arbitrarily assign values to help organize. So the example would be, if you're trying to gather data on men and women, you assign men 0 and women 1, and you run. The problem is mathematics, the entire system of mathematics is built on the fact that 1 is greater than 0. There is a relationship between those numbers, and 1 is greater than 0. So all of the operations you perform is predicated on that reality. So when you arbitrarily assign them for organizational purposes, that's really helpful until you start doing math with them. Because women are not greater than men, men are not greater than women. So you can't assign them numbers that have a greater than, less than relationship, because it's going to skew your numbers, right? So I read this paper, and there's a lot of stuff like that in how they handle their data and how they handle their statistics that I was like, this doesn't discount everything you're saying, but the argument that you're making is not nearly as strong as you think it is. So there's also the reality that none of it's experimental data. It's all, we're kind of gathering it after the fact, which you can draw correlations, but you can't show causation. Like that's where my mathematical mind goes, is you're noticing things, but you can't possibly attribute direct causation. Like that's not. So on one hand, I think critical race theory in kind of that form, in the highly academic form, I think it is way overblown, and I think that it makes a lot bigger claims than it actually has evidence for. And some of you right now, you're cheering, you're like, yeah, he's bashing critical race theory. But on the flip side, there are correlations and there are patterns we see, and this is something undergrad me never would have said. Right, undergrad me would have stopped right there and said, critical race theory is a bunch of bunk, and we would have moved forward. I like to think I've grown a little bit since then. In some ways, in other ways I've devolved, but because something I've come to is, when you deal with people, perception frequently matters just as much as reality does. So whether or not there is systematic inequality, whether it's race or anything else, if someone perceives that if I'm going to show them the love of Christ, which is my higher goal, right? Sometimes I maybe have to concede a little bit to show them love. And I think there are some realities where there are places where there is inequality, right? Where there is kind of a undercurrent or I hesitate to use the word systemic, because for something to be systemic, I think it has to be like codified. It has to be baked in, and in most places, you're not going to find laws actively on the books, at least not that are actively enforced, that are racist or sexist or whatever your ist is, right? Um, so I hesitate to use the word systemic, but I think there are undercurrents that we have to deal with. Um, and I'm optimistic that they're fading. I kind of is where I close, because I think there is definitely in positions of power and leadership in a lot of different places. It's kind of a boys' club, and we can and it's a bunch. I mean, frankly, for a lot of these places, it's a bunch of old white dudes.
Mm-hmm.
And we complain, oh, it's sexist, it's racist because they're old white dudes. Um, it's and I think it's probably it's I think it's more fundamental than that. I I don't think that the reason that they're kind of exclusive of other races or other people, I don't think it's because there's like a racist problem. I think they're like, these are my boys that we've been leading this company or this whatever for 50 years. They're not going to give up their power to anybody, right? If I were to walk in straight white male, they'd be like, screw you too, man. Um, so that's kind of my when I think about critical theory, specifically critical race theory. That's to answer your initial question. That's what comes to mind for me is kind of we're looking for systematic inequalities, systematic problems, um, and how I feel about it is I think a lot of the causal statements are overblown, but that's not to say that we shouldn't think about this stuff and we shouldn't
Mm-hmm.
be careful about this stuff and if necessary take action with this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
How'd I do? Did I
I think
pass?
I think you did pretty good. I want to clarify a few things here and put them
Like
in like
like this podcast. If you hate something I said,
I want to put the some of this in like human language and not just in like academic language, because uh I feel
did
like
I
that'll
geek
help
out there?
moderately. uh
Sorry,
that's all right, it happens
my
to the
brain's
best
a
of us.
thesaurus.
um anyway, so like let's put what you were talking about with correlation and causation into uh an example here. One of the frequently cited examples that critical race theory points to is something like home values, where critical race theory will look at populations of each race that is identified in the United States, and it will look at the average home value for those different racial and ethnic groups. And uh, if you looked at those numbers, it is true that the average white person has a higher value home than the average Black person or average Hispanic person. I don't remember where East Asian falls into that. I think much closer to white. But it does identify a disparity there. And I think this is where something that you were kind of trying to describe, at least I think, was getting at, in terms of its use as a tool to diagnose issues. Critical theory can be pretty helpful, and just and above and beyond even critical race theory, because it'll show you where there are statistical imbalances in things and where we can maybe start to do some things to address that. But what often happens and I think this is what Josh was getting at beyond that, is that the diagnosis gets turned into the problem. So
Well, see,
where
that's something maybe I think is where, because when I think diagnosis, I think, the doctor telling you this is the problem.
Mhm,
So I would say noticing those disparities, call it like an indicator light, like your check engine light comes on.
mhm.
Um, so it tells you that maybe there's something you need to look at. Now it could just be there's a spider web in your engine, or it could be that like you haven't changed your oil in 2 years and your engine's about to become a rock, right? Um,
To quote
so
my
I,
mechanic recently, it looks like teriyaki in there.
ugh. So I'd say when we see those numbers, I think it's more of an indicator light than it is a
that's
diagnosis.
that's probably a better comparison. Yeah, but it shows where there are problems, and then you have to actually do legwork to address them from there.
Or where
Um,
there could be problems. Because, like with the home value example, my immediate thought is if you take Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and the owners of all these NFL teams, and you take their homes and their multiple homes that they own, those are outliers that are going to really skew your statistical numbers,
mhm.
right? If someone like Jerry Jones owns a $500 million home for whatever freaking reason, better be magic or something. Like that's gonna. So I think you're right, and you need to look at it, but you have to look at it with a balanced view. I think.
On the home value example, though, you mentioned that you have a hard time saying systematic, and I want to push you on that a little bit, because one of the things that I think we can talk about this both theologically and in terms of the way that we approach this in the modern day is that systematic does not mean that it has to be something that's been a modern problem or a modern issue. Um, Going back to the Pentateuch, it's described that sins are curses on the third and fourth generation, not just on the generation that commits them. Um, and that's not to say that like every time that we sin, our great grandkids are going to pay the price for it, but it means that the sins
But they
that we
very
commit,
easily could.
yeah, the sins that we commit now could very easily have an impact on the lives of our grandkids and great grandkids.
Like
And
it's the example that comes to mind for me is if there is a, and maybe this kind of goes back to our last week's podcast a little bit. If a family falls apart and
mhm,
you have a broken family, the chances of those kids then getting into families that fall apart or are never really together, the statistics go up a huge amount because they were never
mhm,
given that example of we stick together through whatever. So
yeah,
you're right. You don't pay for every sin, but you're right in that there's like it gets passed on, right?
mhm,
Problems don't just disappear with a new
mhm.
generation.
And so with a lot of the issues that are being pointed to as systemic in the world today, it's not necessarily modern issues, though there might be modern issues that underlie some of these things. It's oftentimes historic issues that are still problems systemically, like the fact that we'll take home values again as the example. um, the reason that neighborhoods are demographically the way that they are for the most part is because of things like redlining, where specific neighborhoods were designated as whites only by developers, by banks, by in some cases governments. Um, and you couldn't get loans or even put a down payment on a house if you were of a certain nationality in a certain area. And because of that, those people were put into another area, and oftentimes the neighborhoods and communities that Black people especially were allowed to live in were not nearly as nice. They were often in industrial areas or polluted areas. or farther away from any sort of amenities. And so their home values just naturally never increased. And that's like, that's not a sin that we're necessarily actively pursuing as a community anymore, but it's something that we feel the effects of because people have now grown up in that community generation after generation. And one of the biggest conveyors of generational wealth in the United States is real estate. So the fact that we as white people grew up in relatively nice neighborhoods where our parents, did your dad own your house when you were growing up?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the bank owned the house, but dad was
Your
working on it.
fair enough. um but like your parents had a mortgage to buy their home,
Yeah.
and like that, they are
Well, and
building wealth in that, and that, like, hypothetically and hopefully will someday come down to us, but in a lot of Black communities that just doesn't really exist.
yeah. Well, and something I want to throw, and this is a tangent that we're not going to pursue, but I think, and you can resist this, but I've lived in all the areas of the country,
Mm-hmm.
and this is reality. So the South always gets their, the stereotype is, Southerners
Mm-hmm.
are racist, whatever. The South has a problem with racism, and I call crap on that because the South was forced to integrate after the Civil War,
Mm-hmm.
and obviously they had terrible problems with that, but they were forced to integrate, and now people have gotten over it. Like everyone who was upset, not everyone, most of the people who were upset about the integration have like died, frankly. um, but because of the systems that were put in place, like race relations have been able to progress
Mm-hmm.
because they were kickstarted.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in places like the Midwest and the North and whatever, the forced integration never happened to that degree.
Mm-hmm.
So like you talk about, my neighborhood that my parents still live in is probably, it's about 50-50 as
Mm-hmm.
far as like the races that live there, right? Are of our, I guess like four, one, two, three, four, five, I guess six neighbors. One was Asian, one was Hispanic, and three were Black, and then the one across the street was white. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so, but and I know you were pushing me back on the systemic thing. I'm gonna hold on to avoiding that because I think the common perception when you use, whether like, it may still be, or it is fair, right? Because there are problems that happened 50, 100, 200 years ago that we're still dealing with the fallout of. um, the reason I am going to kind of resist using it is because I think when you say that today, people immediately say, okay, so we have to change the system.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think the system is necessarily what's broken anymore. I think there are consequences from previously broken systems that we have to deal with. And I
Mm-hmm.
think when we say just things like there's a systemic problem, I think in part that alleviates responsibility to actually deal with the problems we have today instead of, looking in hindsight and saying, oh, that was really messed up that our ancestors did, or that,
Mm-hmm.
whatever happened back then, that was really messed up, and that's why we have this stuff today. And I'm thinking, yes, we can admit that was messed up, but let's actually deal with today's problems and not try to,
Mm-hmm.
deal with problems that were happening. So with the home value thing, um, yeah, that there was that system back then, but I think and I'm not an economist. I don't know what the solutions would be today, but I think you put things in place that help solve the problem today,
Mm-hmm. I
right?
and I I agree with you there, and I think I think, like, in terms of your prescription of what needs to happen based on this warning light that we've now perhaps started to diagnose, right? I think that's like, I'm with you on that note. I just think it's like, I don't know. I come at it from a different perspective on just basically just the word systematic there, or systemic. Not systematic. Systematic is theology. Um, but I think all of this is to say, like, circling back to our original question that we started on 20 minutes ago, critical theory is a tool for looking at where there might be disparities in society. And as a tool for that, it's pretty good. But in terms of its capability to then accurately diagnose the problem or even provide solutions, it starts to get used and abused.
And I think that this is something, you name whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's something that gets taken too far.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, which is exactly what you're saying. Like, it's great to
Mm-hmm.
notice these differences and to say, well, maybe we need to start to think about them. But then people are like, well, it must be because of this, and now we have to do this. And it's like, well, you just wanted to do this. You just wanted to do this, and you're using this as an excuse to push to what you wanted
Mm-hmm.
to do.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I wonder, you might disagree with me strongly on what I'm about to say, so we'll see. After the shoot, what was his first name? George Floyd.
Mm-hmm.
When that happened, I had a friend reach out to me and say something along the lines of, "Why aren't you using your platform to speak about this?" And I thought of it because this was the kind of friend, goes to protests, does the whole, and we might have talked about this before, but I don't think that you can systemically address these issues. The fixes to these problems aren't systemic ones, right? I am increasingly convinced that society doesn't. You can't systematize change in society. Not I mean, you can, but you have to go to really drastic measures,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like
My head
Stalin
immediately
made
went,
it.
yeah, my head
Yeah,
immediately went to the way that the
Stalin
Nazis took
managed
over the
to,
church.
well, and Stalin managed to systematize all sorts of things in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
He just had to kill a ton
Yeah.
of people to do it, right? So
Yeah.
let me I don't think that protests, I don't think that legislation, I I don't think that programs can fix Jack, can change Jack, right? I am convinced that real change, real progress for these solutions, and this is where I kind of want to make a theological turn, is in how we live in our circles and how we treat one another and how we and real change happens from relationships, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's one thing for me to, well, I'm tired of using this housing example because I'm right now just, I'm pissed about housing values myself. So
That's fair.
for context, for anyone listening who's not in this region that I'm in, the average home value in Eastvale, California is something like $865,000. If I want to buy a house, I need to take a loan out for almost $1 million. So I'm gonna not use that housing example because I'm salty about that right now.
That's fair.
So let's say, oh, let's say something like gender bias. It's all well and good for you to like say we're going to legislate whatever, but really, I think if you want to address gender bias, you need to treat both men and women with respect in your life, encourage other people around you to do the same, and when you have the opportunity to do things that support gender equality, I guess, um, you do so, right? I genuinely don't think that really for a lot of this stuff the solution is passing a law or doing a program. I think it's act right as an individual, and if everyone starts to act right as an individual, you have the problem solved. Right? Now there's the theological reality of sin, and you're never going to get everyone to do the right thing all the time.
Mhm.
Um, but that's kind of where I come down on a lot of this critical theory stuff. Is it's great for us to look at, but the solution, as much as it kind of sucks that you can't just snap your fingers and fix it, it's not something that the government or big companies or anything can just fix. It has to be individual changes on a societal scale, not societal changes trying to work into an individual scale. If that So that's where I stand on a lot of this stuff. I think people overinflate it, and they I guess this is just like my solution based brain. They're going after stuff, and I'm like, that's not going to fix your problem.
Mhm.
Um, and maybe an example is a lot of the stuff that happens with welfare, right? We say, well, this is going to help people who are economically disadvantaged, and for some, I'm sure it does help some people.
Mhm.
But like my mom worked with a lot of people on welfare. She worked at a nonprofit, for it was like a pregnancy resource center, for first time moms, especially economically disadvantaged ones. And for a lot of them, it wasn't a stepping stone to economic security or economic independence. It allowed them to persist in the place that they were at.
Mhm.
Right. So like she was supporting some like 14, 15-year-old moms who, when you talked about like what got you here, they said my mom told me it was my turn to have a kid, so we'd keep getting the financial assistance. Right. And I think a lot of those instances when you just try and we're going to put this big broad program that kind of ignores individual context, you
Mhm.
don't end up solving your problem except in a few cases.
Mhm.
And like I said, I'm sure in a few cases it has accomplished its goals, but I think across the board, a lot of these things, they either don't accomplish their goals or they actually end up being detrimental to the goals they started out with. So that's where I come down on the critical theory, right? And you can rip me a new one if you like. I don't know if you're. What do you think, Ben? I've talked a lot. What do you think?
So I think I'm half with you and I'm half not. I think the
Are you
ideal
half with me and
answer,
half against me? Or are you half with me and half meh?
uh, probably more the latter, but maybe a little of the former. Um, I'm just gonna position myself here as the ultimate fence sitter.
I like that.
Because
I mean, it's uncomfortable, but it's good.
I feel like that is, I mean, that's where we're called to as Christians all the time, because
As Bierman
the
would say, hold the tension.
yeah, hold the tension, or as Manbuns and Jesus will say, ignore the pain in your butt, as you are
I
fence
will
sitting.
not say that. That is not nearly as like catchy.
Anyway,
Get a better fence.
yeah, no, it's chain link. Anyway, um, so on the systemic issues thing, I think it all kind of comes down to the diagnosis, right? If we have this warning light go off if we look at the problem and the diagnosis truly is, okay, there's uh, nothing wrong inherently with the way that we're trying to address this systemically, but people are abusing the system, there might be some tweaks you can make systemically, but ultimately you need to address the people, right? Sometimes, though, I think there are times where we look at the issue at play and the problem really is systemic, and that it takes advantage of the people who are in a position where they don't have the ability to respond to the system. Um, it's not necessarily nearly as blatant or obvious as it was 40, 50, 60 years ago. Um, citing specifically the time that you were talking about where the South was forced to reckon with racial reconciliation. And I don't honestly disagree with you. I think at this point, there's probably more racism in the north of this country than there is in the South, though it exists everywhere. I don't know. Maybe it's just everywhere. But like, I think the solutions are never as straightforward as it's all an individual problem or it's all a systemic problem. It's almost always going to be a combination of the two. And you need to actually look at the specific problem at play to address that. And I think where you're incredibly uncomfortable and where I will definitely get uncomfortable is when we look at an issue like housing prices and go, well, white people's houses are worth more than black people's houses, so we need to give people money to make up for the difference in that. Because all you're doing is taking the problem and saying that the solution to this has to just be forcing it back to even, right? It's not addressing the underlying issues of like certain communities are possibly or potentially racist. It's not addressing the issues of certain communities struggle massively with pollution issues or are underfunded for their public works, and so underserved populations keep ending up there. There's so much just like under the surface that we can't necessarily write off either answer, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, and here's I think why I maybe focus more on the individual is when you start jumping into all of that. Because first of all, you can, again, without going to extreme lengths, you can never really establish undeniable causality because you can't experiment with people. Like we,
I mean, you can,
that's
but you get
not
in trouble
allowed.
for it.
I'm going to take you 50 people and put you in this neighborhood, and we're going to take you 50 people and put you in this neighborhood because we want to see what happens, right? We can't do that. And I think, like you were saying, there's so many things that go into any, and those are just things you can kind of trace the line. But then you also have to talk about things like, is there cultural pressure, right? Is there, are there other things that are playing into this that are less tangible? And when I think about all that, you can't, it feels like you can't do anything. And I think because in some respect we can't, because the simple reality is we're never going to get to perfection, right? It's against our nature. And I think that's one of the reasons I focus so much on the individual, because I think it genuinely is. It's that cheesy tagline that so many people have on their wall, but I think there's a lot of truth to it. Something along the lines of, God, give me the strength to change what I can and the grace to accept what I can't. Right? So I push for the individual stuff because I don't really have the power to do much else. Um, so I think that's probably part of it. But I something that you said really did catch me. If you are looking more and more into causation and there is a systemic cause,
Mm-hmm.
I'm in agreement. Then you have to do the systemic fix, right? If you find
Mm-hmm.
there's a law that's or a policy that's doing something it shouldn't be doing, obviously fix that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think as we're thinking, what do I do?
Mm-hmm.
Live, live in the way we're called to live, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when
Episode 1, don't be a jerk.
don't be a like it real I really think a lot of this does come down to like the issues with racism, sexism, ageism, whatever. Don't be a jerk, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we live with the love and compassion, right? Let's expand this, right? If everyone lived with the love and the compassion that we are called to live with as even let's just say all the Christians,
Mm-hmm.
we'll say 50%. I don't know what the statistic is anymore, but let's say 50% of the country is Christian. If every single Christian acted with the love and the compassion that we are called to live with as Christians, a lot of these problems of critical theory, I genuinely believe would disappear.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not disappear, but they would be greatly abated
Mm-hmm.
because you have people treating each other with love and compassion and grace.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to cover a whole lot of stuff, a whole lot of
Mm-hmm.
the problems that we have.
Mm-hmm. If
So
I can give
maybe
you,
that's part of it. Yeah.
I'm going to give you one very concrete example of where I think a systemic change kind of thing can work, and then kind of give you a theological thought, and maybe we can wrap this up
All right. You
before we
think we've
keep beating.
adequately made everybody upset?
Yeah, I think we've beaten several dead horses. But I'm gonna cite a story that my wife has told me. She did an internship at UT Austin. Um, I think it was after her junior year of undergrad or fellowship, research fellowship, and part of that fellowship was that they took a look at different um, environmental things that were happening around the state, and one of those was a neighborhood that they looked at. Not really going to mention where, just so we don't have any random Texas listeners who get pissed off at us. Um, but this was a predominantly Black neighborhood. And because Texas doesn't really zone anything anywhere, um, there were no prohibitions in place to stop I can't remember what kind of factory, but a factory that used toxic chemicals in their production process from dropping their factory right next to a pretty substantial neighborhood that immediately tanked the home values in the area and slowly started poisoning the water supplies of the surrounding neighborhood. And so when my wife visited, there were several blocks that had been razed around this factory because people's houses were unlivable. Um, and people had gotten some compensation for the houses that had been lost, but it was not equal to the value those houses would have had if that factory would have never been allowed to been put there. And that's an issue. That's an issue that is systemic. The system allowed that factory to be built in a lower class neighborhood that happened to be Black, and it had severe and significant consequences for the residents of that neighborhood.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and in hearing that, yeah, there's a systemic solution, but I think the where I my thought goes to that that's a problem generally. that's not just a critical theory
Oh
problem,
yeah.
right? If
Yeah.
you're a factory dumping toxic waste, you shouldn't you shouldn't be my residential anything. I don't care if it's low income, mid income, high income. Like, if you're a factory dumping toxic waste, I've driven through Texas. There's plenty of wasteland for you to go to. Go there. It's already useless because it's a desert, right?
The western
Go
half of the
there.
state is, at least. But all of that is to say, like, sometimes when critical theory like identifies issues, like market values of homes, sometimes there is a systemic issue that has a systemic fix. And that I cite that as a specific example where I think there is a pretty clear systemic fix to that issue. But that also like leads me to thinking about the way that God thinks about justice. And this is where I'm going to kind of wrap up today, because God doesn't just do justice on individuals. He does it both individually and corporately. Individual examples would be something like, I think it's Ananias and Sapphira, the couple in Acts that the ground swallows. They just
dropped dead. They just
dropped out. The ground swallowing the couple.
That's
is in
Korah.
Yeah.
Korah's rebellion.
Yeah. Anyway, multiple times where God has smote people for being unfaithful. But on the flip side, think about the way that he handled doing justice on like Sodom and Gomorrah, or in the case of Noah, the flood destroyed the earth. He did justice on everyone all at once because everyone was, what's the word I'm looking for? Complicit in the injustice. They were all complicit in the sin, in the problems that had formed. And he found the one faithful family and saved them. But otherwise, his justice was very corporate.
Yeah. Well, and not to get too far in, but we look at this because we're American, the whole idea of our justice system is innocent until proven guilty.
Mm-hmm.
Y'all, we're all guilty, right? As far as God is concerned.
Yeah.
In the absence of Jesus Christ, the punishment we deserve is death.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, when you go back and Abraham is pleading for Sodom and Gomorrah, he says, God, if you find 20 righteous people, 10 righteous people, 5 righteous people in the city, will you spare the city? And God says, yeah. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, by God's standards, no one is righteous.
Mm-hmm.
So, sucks for Sodom and Gomorrah.
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm going to do one takeaway from this, it's have a cool head and a balanced approach to critical theory. And by that I mean, don't take it too far one way, right? Don't say, well, we notice this disparity, which means it has to be this, it has to be this, it has to be this, we have to do this, right? Recognize the limitations of what it can tell you. Mm-hmm. But on the other side, when someone says critical blank theory, don't flip out and start. Keep your fruit of the Spirit in mind. Treat them with love and kindness and compassion. And recognize that we're called to do that in all sorts of situations and all sorts of places. So, I mean, I guess my takeaway is calm down and don't be a jerk. Is that how we do
That's
it?
very on brand. That's very on brand.
Yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that. We're gonna leave it at that.
Enough. All right, I'm gonna say that my takeaway is to recognize how we've been catechized. I'm going to make that a catchphrase for us there. Yeah, no, mine's on my tablet, but mine is also right here. Basically, what I mean by that is recognize how you've been brought up to understand the world. And for people for whom like critical theory is the end all be all when it comes to fixing the world's problems, that's likely how they've been catechized. And it's not that they're trying to personally destroy your life, but they're trying to do what they can.
You may
Probably.
Our listeners might have made enemies. I don't know.
Yeah, that's fair. I
don't know who you pissed off.
Generally, they are not trying to personally destroy your life. More often than not, they are trying to solve the same problems that you see around you. And they're doing it in the way that they think will best work. And so my encouragement to you based on that takeaway is to engage them in that conversation. And like Josh and I did, see how your views on the situation differ. See how you might find middle ground. And above all, don't be a jerk.
Well, and before we close, because I really like your takeaway, I want everyone to kind of hear this, and hopefully you've stuck with us this long. In case you didn't pick up, I'm pretty sure Ben and I are in two different places on this. But, you know, we're still going to be doing a podcast together. We still, well, I still love Ben. I don't know how he feels about me. But like, we were able to have this discussion, even though we approach these problems from different perspectives and with different strategies. And, you know, at the end of the day, I am still convinced that we're both in a faithful place on how we're acting in the world and how we're interacting with people. Mm-hmm. So, and if you take nothing else away from this podcast, have dialogues like this one that are calm, that are relaxed, and that, you know, obviously you're free to talk a little bit of crap, but show love to each other.
And I think one thing that may not even show up apparently to our listeners, but I think has happened in this, is that I think we've both convinced each other a little bit of where we may have been in error. And I think that says something about Christian conversation. And if you haven't listened to our first episode on how not to be a jerk, go back and listen to that. And then
listen to it, but warning, the audio quality is not great.
Fair. I didn't have this mic yet.
Yeah, don't get too far away from your volume knob, because for me, you're gonna have to turn it up for Ben and down for me. Anyway, yeah. It is a good episode, though, I think.
Yeah, we might have to revisit just Christian conversation in general at some point. But another encouragement, and perhaps this can be our kind of in total prayer thought for today, unless you have something further to add. Pray for patience, pray for understanding, and pray for limitless love and grace, especially when you're talking or engaging with someone that you don't agree with, because you never know how you or they or both of you might grow, or how the Spirit is going to move through those conversations.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
Cool.
So
should we go?
Yeah, I guess we're done. Brothers and sisters, go in peace, serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.